Okay, well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this day one of the FME Desktop Advanced Training course for FME 2019. This is the first time we've run this course for 2019, so we're very much looking forward to running through this and teaching you everything that we can about FME, including some things that are really new pieces of functionality. My name is Mark Ireland. I'm a product evangelist, I guess you can call me, at Safe Software. I'll be your instructor for today and for a couple of other days later this week as well. Joining me today is my colleague Ryan Craig. Do you want to say a quick hello, everyone, Ryan? Hey,
Hello,
so
everyone.
hi, Ryan. And I'm guessing you're in Vancouver, probably in the Safe office. I'm working out of my home office, a bit further to the east. In Manitoba. So wherever you're from in the world anyway, welcome to everyone today. So the first thing we need to do for our training course is to get your virtual machine set up. Hopefully you've started your machine already. If not, there's a link we can give to you. Let me just copy that link. The sooner you do this, the better, because you won't be able to thank you, Ryan. We won't be able to carry out any exercises without your virtual machine running, and so it's good to get that going as soon as you can. And if there are any problems creating or setting up your virtual machine, please do let us know. Ryan is the guy the technical genius who set all of these systems up for us. So he knows all about how to debug any problems and get your virtual machines working. And so, yeah, please do ping any questions to us. And besides that, Ryan's a very good FME instructor as well. So, and knows a lot about the product. So he'll be doing some training later this week, I'm sure, as well. So, yeah, so hopefully you've got your virtual machine started. If you have and you log in, you'll be able to find a link to the Git book, the FME Training Manual. This is, okay, so just to run through the intro very quickly, this is the manual for the advanced level training course. It's something that we like to use for users to build upon their basic training, their basic knowledge. We try and include everything that you'll probably need to take your skills to the next level. So these are things that most people will actually need to use at some point. So whatever chapter we're running through, you should find it fairly interesting. And the chapter today we're going to cover is advanced attribute handling. Later on in the week, we'll be covering workspace design, reading and writing, advanced parameter use, and custom transformers. And we're all looking at all of those sections from an advanced point of view. So I don't think we need to go through the legal issues there. So we'll skip that page. And we're going to, like I said, we're going to cover those 5 different chapters. We're going to cover them over the course of this week. I think we've got 3 hours assigned for every day, but we may be a bit shorter than that. Hopefully never longer than that, but we'll see how it goes as we work through the training. It would be great if you have some experience of using FME. Hopefully you've taken the basic training and then maybe got a bit of extra knowledge and experience using FME. If not, it would be really useful to be aware of transformers, readers and writers, data filtering, attribute management, things like that would be very useful to be aware of. So what we'll do first anyway is carry out a skill review exercise just to get us into the training with a bit of hands-on thing, just to make sure everyone's up to speed. And if you look on your computer, if you've taken the basic training, you'll be aware of this, but if not, if you look on your computer, C drive, FME Data 2019, there's a data folder, an output folder, resources and workspaces. The data folder is obviously where we're going to where all of the data we're going to be using for this course is stored. So we've got all sorts of different data sets and folders there. And the workspaces is the other important one. If we look under Workspaces Desktop Advanced, you'll find all of the different workspaces for all of the exercises that we do. So if you ever get stuck in an exercise, you can look at the completed workspace and figure out maybe what might have been the problem. So yeah, please do look in those folders and make yourself aware of the different folders on here. What I often do is try to find the options on here. It's got to be somewhere. It's got to be settings, properties. No. Okay, I try and normally turn on the file extensions just so I can see that, but I can't. Here we go. Options. Change folder and search options. And I just like to turn off that option that says hide the file extensions, just so I can see that a bit easier. Sometimes it's a bit easier when you've got a folder of files, like in the Parks folder. If I couldn't see the ID, the file extension, it'd all be called Parks, which wouldn't help a lot. So I generally do that. Okay, so like I mentioned, we'll do a basic skills review. And we'll see how we are and your basic FME knowledge. So if you can browse to this part of the manual and have FME open. So again, hopefully you've got your virtual machine started up. Once you've gone to that page that we chatted out earlier and you filled in your information and you've hit the request button, you should get the link back almost straight away with a link to remote desktop into that machine. However, the machine is still starting up and it will take probably 5 to 10 minutes for the machines to start up after you've got that email back. So if you get your email and you click on the button and it doesn't work straight away, don't worry about it. The machines take about 5 to 10 minutes to start up. So that's why I'm sort of taking it a little bit slow right at the start of this course. And this is why we also put the basic review exercise in here as well, just to, if you don't do this exercise, it's not too much of an issue. So again, if any issues starting or connecting to the machine, please do let us know. And if you really need to, you can always run FME on your own computer. You need to download the data and have a copy of that locally, but you could do that if you really wanted. Okay, so enough of me talking about the virtual machines. Let's get on with this exercise. So during the course, we'll come up against an exercise. This is where you do some hands-on work, but at the same time, I'll be walking you through this exercise as well, just to make sure you're all up to speed with what's going on. So what's this exercise? Well, we're going to use some public art stored in an Excel spreadsheet and some transit stations stored in a file geodatabase, which is obviously a spatial format. And what we're going to do is just look at some basic reading and writing and transformer use. Sorry, I was just sending a link out to the exercise, just in case you need that. So the idea is you've been hired by a city GIS department for your first project. You've been asked to create a map that shows public artwork within a 5-minute walking radius of each transit station. So fairly straightforward things in FME. So we're going to have to read the spreadsheet data. We're going to turn it into spatial features. We're going to reproject it to the right coordinate system. We're going to read some transit stations, create a buffer around them to say that's a 5-minute walking radius. We're going to do this sort of point and polygon overlay, and then we're going to style the data and write it out to Google KML. So yeah, so let's make a start on this. So first step, create a new workspace, open FME Workbench. You should find that under the Start menu, Start, FME Workbench 2019. We are using, let's see, 2019.001. So we're using a slightly upgraded version to the release version of 2019. Okay, so add a new reader with the following parameters. Well, you know how to add a new reader, I hope. If not, click Readers, Add Reader on the menu bar of Workbench, and it'll pop this dialog up. And in there we can type Excel and we can browse for the data set. One thing I can show you is a little bit of a shortcut maybe is if you've got the data available in a browser, in a file explorer, I can actually drag and drop that file from there into the Add Reader dialog. In fact, I could just drop it into the canvas on Workbench, and that would work just fine as well. But just a little bit of a tip there. You can drag and drop data sets from a file explorer into Workbench. So we've got that. We're going to click this option that says single merge feature types. What does that mean? Well, it means there's several spreadsheets in this Excel, several sheets in this Excel spreadsheet, and we just want to read them all as one single block of data, is what we're saying there. And the other thing we're going to do is click in the coordinate system setting there, and we're going to type LL84, just so that FME knows that these coordinates that are in the public art data are in latitude and longitude. So I'm going to click OK. That data set is going to get added to my workspace. And there it is. Now, really, it would be nice if we could look at that data and see it somehow. So the best thing we're going to do here is click on the Run button on the drop down next to the Run button. Make sure feature caching is on, which it is, and run the workspace. You might get prompted, that's fine. And we've run that, and the data's been read into FME and cached. And we can click that little green button to the right there and see the data. And you can see in the visual preview window, there's the spreadsheet version of the data. We can see a sort of spreadsheet look and table to there. So we have all the different artwork. And as I click on those, you'll see in the window to the right, little dots highlight to show you where that feature is on the map. So that's what we're dealing with in terms of data from the spreadsheet. And even though we only read it from an Excel spreadsheet, you'll notice that it has got a longitude column and a latitude column. And basically FME said, okay, we'll use those columns to turn it into actual spatial data. So you didn't need to do that, FME did that for us. So we've read the data, we've looked at it, let's add another reader now. We need to read the data for transit stations. So again, you can click Readers, Add Reader. This time it's a different data set. Let me see if I can drag and drop a geodatabase into here. I don't see why not. So it's Data, Community Mapping, and you can drag and drop that GDB file into here and just change the format to geodatabase open API format. And it's having to think about that. You don't have to drag and drop the data sets into here. You can click the browse button instead, but I'm sure you know that. It really is having to think about that. There we go, that's better. We go into the parameters dialog, and there's a list, an option there to list all the tables. We can click on the browse button, it'll tell us, well, what tables are in this database, and the only one we want is transit stations. So we can put a check mark against that. Click OK. OK again. We'll change the workflow to individual feature types, although we're only reading one table, so it doesn't really make a lot of difference there. Click OK. And there we go, transit stations. Again, you can hit the Run button and cache that data. I'm going to turn off the prompt option. We don't want to prompt every time. And we can have a look at the transit stations, and you can see there are how many, 11 different transit stations that we've got. And again, you can click on them in the table view and they should highlight in the map view, like so. So we have transit stations as points, we have artworks as points. They're in different coordinate systems though. If we go back and look at the transit stations, if we query that and we have this little window open here that says feature information, we can see that's in UTM 83. If I click on one of the, well, we know these are in latitude and longitude because that's a coordinate system that we set when we read the data. So we've got data that's in two different coordinate systems. And in fact, if I selected both of those feature types and tried to view them at once, we'd see that they're in completely different areas. Like the artworks are all down here and the transit stations are all up here and don't overlap because they're in different coordinate systems. So we're going to have to fix that, and we'll do that with the Reproject Transformer. So we'll put a Reproject Transformer. Again, hopefully you're familiar with adding transformers. It's just a case of typing the name onto the canvas and it will pop up, and we're going to connect it up to all, which is the spreadsheet data. If we want to make sure we know that's the spreadsheet data, we can select it, press Control K, and it'll pop up with a label to tell us, yeah, that's the public art. And we can do that same thing with the transit stations as well. But that's just a little bit extra, just so you know what I'm doing is when you're looking at my screen. Okay, so we'll open the settings for the Reprojector. It says the source coordinate system, we'll read it from the feature, that's fine. And the destination is going to be UTM 83-10. So Universal Transverse Mercator, NAD 83 Zone 10. So that's the coordinate system that we want to move the artworks into. And that's because it's the same coordinate system that the transit data uses. So now I can run that. In fact, I can just press the F5 key and it will just run anything that's not cached, which means the projector. So you should have a workspace that looks like this. Now, if we click on the community map and the Reprojector, we should see both sets of data in the same view, I hope. Yes, it's hard to see the colors there because they're I could change the colors, I guess, at the transit stations, but it doesn't really matter too much. I'm happy they're in the same coordinate system now and I can see them in the same view. There we go. So yeah, so we've got the data now and it's in the right coordinate systems. What we want to do now is find out all of the artwork that falls within a 5-minute walking radius for each transit station. 5-minute walking radius, well, we're going to put a 250-meter buffer around. I think I could walk more than 250 meters in 5 minutes, but we're just going to assume that for this case. So we'll put a buffer transformer down, and we're going to connect that up to the transit stations. So we put the buffer around the transit stations. I guess we could put the buffer around the artwork, but this seems to me to be the better way of doing it. We'll look at the parameters dialog, and in the buffer amount, we set that to 250. And again, really you should do this after every time almost that you want to do something. After you've done something, just press F5 to run that transformer just to make sure it looks okay. Do we have buffers? Yes, we do. We have buffers around the transit stations, and I could click on the Reprojector as well and see the artwork within those buffers. So I could even do it manually and just pick out the artworks manually, but obviously that's not what we're trying to do here. We want an automate solution. So what we're going to do is put a transformer down called a spatial filter. While I do that, we've got a question in that says, do we have a transformer that calculates distance based on time? Yes, we do have something like that. Let me see, I'm trying to remember what that one's called. See, even if you used FME for quite a while, sometimes you can't remember all of the transformers, especially if you don't use them that often. But there is one that does a sort of distance. No, I can't remember. We can look it up because I know there's examples on the knowledge base because I know they're there because I created them. So we can have a look at that. Network cost calculator. Thank you, Ryan. Network cost calculator. You can bring a bunch of roads into there. You could bring a point feature like a transit station, and then you could say, hey, calculate me a distance. And it's by length. So you would normally say, like, tell me what's within 500 meters or something. But what you would have to do is say, well, I'm going to assume that you're walking at 3 miles per hour, 5 kilometers per hour. And from that, you would pick out an attribute that you'd set up to give it the length. So if you say I'm walking at 5 kilometers an hour, I want to know how many, I want to know how far I could walk in an hour. Well, you select an attribute that's got number 5 in it, and that will show you all of the roads that you could get to in that time. So we do have one that will calculate distance based on time, but you have to make an assumption about what speed people are traveling at. Okay, so back to this exercise. We want to find all of the artwork inside the transit station buffers. The transit station buffers are our filter, so we can connect those up to the filter port, and the public art is our candidate. So a candidate basically means these are the ones we want to find out information about, and do let us know, it says. So basically that's a spatial filter. You'll notice the lines are crossed, whereas they're not in the manual. That's because I can right click on the spatial filter and say, just move that port up and down. So now the candidate port's at the top and the lines aren't crossed. So that's a useful thing to know about. We'll look at the spatial filter parameters. What are we trying to test? Well, we want to do sort of a point in polygon thing. So it's not intersects, it's contains. So we want filter contains candidate and also filter touches candidate, just in case there's an artwork that exactly sits on the 250 meter buffer line. So basically we're saying if it's inside that buffer or it touches the buffer, then it's a pass. So we click OK, and we've got multiple filters. You can look at the different parameters. Really, the only one we're interested in is that spatial predicates to test. What are we looking for there? And again, I can just run that and say, well, let's see what's coming out of that. And there's 52 features. So basically we can say there's 52 pieces of art that fall within a 250 meter radius, 5-minute walking distance of a station. And the last thing we want to do is to write this out to Google KML. So what I'm going to do is put a KML Styler transformer down. That lets us apply a style to our KML output. In fact, any transformer that has the word styler in it often relates to a single format. So we have a DGN styler for MicroStation, DWG styler for AutoCAD, Excel styler, KML, MapInfo, Word styler even. So if you want to write a Word document, you can style your text, PDF styler, PowerPoint styler. So they all style your data in different ways for when it's written out. In a KML Styler, what can we do? Well, we can pick a color, we can pick an icon, we can pick a label style. So for example, in the icon, I can hit this browse button and it'll pop up a little dialog. It says these are all the icons you've got available. Note there's a couple of folders that you can go, subfolders you can look at as well. But anyway, we can just pick any icon out of here. I quite like F5, sort of a red outline pentagon with a green center, or G4. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, just pick an icon. You can set a scale that's bigger or smaller, you can set the opacity. The label, we don't really want a label, so we're going to set the scale to 0 and the opacity to 0 for the labels, because I don't want to see a label. I just want to see the point on the screen. So we're going to click OK on that. The last thing to do is add a KML writer. Click Writers, Add Writer from the menu bar. So the format's KML, obviously, so we type that in. Equally, obviously, I can't drag and drop a data set in for the output, so I'm going to use the Browse button. And most of the data we write in this training course goes to Output, Training, and what are we going to call it here? We are going to call it Art Near Transit. We're going to call it, no, we're going to call it Artworks. Doesn't really matter, I guess, if we deviate a little bit from the manual. The important thing here is the feature type definition. In other words, how do you want to define the layer that you're writing? And we're going to say define it automatically. Like whatever attributes come into this, get written out. And it pops this dialog up and says, okay, what do you want to call the feature type? This is what we're going to call Art Near Transit. Excuse me. And if we look under the User Attributes tab, nothing's there because nothing's connected yet. That's why. So if I connect it up, then go back to the User Attributes tab, then I can change it from automatic to manual, and I can start changing this definition. So I can say we don't need object ID, we don't need predicate. To be honest, we don't need latitude and longitude either. I could probably get rid of those, like so. And just click OK. And hit F5 and run that translation. There was no point running the KML Styler really, because it doesn't do anything apart from style the data for the output. So there we go. So let's open up the folder we wrote that to, artworks.kml. I can double click on that and it should open up in Google Earth. Whether it'll stream well so that you can see it, I'm not sure, but hopefully you'll see that we have the artworks in Google Earth in the style that I chose, which was a certain icon with no labels on it. Okay. Yeah, we don't need any tips, thank you. Okay, I got to start it again for DirectX mode. So hopefully it starts a bit quicker this time. There we go. Yeah, we don't need any tips. And it zooms in and we should see the data. There we go. So those are artworks in the city of Vancouver that are within a 5-minute walk of a transit station. And I'm sure I can probably turn off some of those other layers that we don't need. Photos, buildings, places, things like that. And if I click on one of these, we should see that it tells us the nearest station, which is Burrard, and it tells us the name and title of the artwork. So that one's called Marker of Change. It's in Thornton Park, and your nearest station is Main Street Science World. So there we go. Hopefully you got the same result that I did, or are very close to getting that result. This is, again, an introductory exercise. If you were having major problems with the exercise and you weren't sure how to place a transformer, how to make a connection, well then you might want to consider that this advanced training course has just come a bit too soon for your FME experience. But if you got through that exercise with minimal problems, then you should be good to go from here. So hopefully, I'm hoping you got through that exercise pretty well. And hopefully, if you hadn't got your virtual machine started, you have now, and you're all ready to go for the actual training proper. Okay, excuse me a second. Okay, so that was just a bit of a warm up to sort of get us into using FME. I guess if it was a public speaking course, then that would be the exercise where we make funny noises and get our voices ready. Well, that was really for us just getting our FME skills back on track and up to speed and remembering the interface and everything. Now we're actually going to look at what we're going to do today, which is advanced attribute handling. Why do we put this in the training? Well, because handling attributes is one of the most common operations in FME. As a user, you will need to set attributes, edit attributes, use them in all sorts of different ways, and that's what we're going to cover today. As you notice on this chapter, at the foot of the chapter it says, "Hi, I'm the FME Lizard. I'm an FME expert and will pop in occasionally." So basically, you should see like little tip windows throughout the manual with little sort of tips and hints in there. And there'll be question and answers as well that you can try out to make sure your knowledge was correct, and so on. So in this chapter, we are going to cover, I think there's about 4 different things we're going to cover. The first thing is constructing attributes, which is really an important one. Then we're going to look at, I'm trying to remember, I think it is conditional values of attributes. Then we're going to look at multiple feature attributes, which is a way to get attributes from multiple features in the flow of data. Then we'll look at null attributes as a final subject. But the first thing we're going to look at today is constructing attributes, because in the basic training we go through how to sort of look at attributes, but we don't really go into too much detail about constructing them and using the editor dialogues. So I'm just going to open up, I've got a bunch of instructor workspaces in here. So workspaces, instructor use, desktop advanced, and I've got a workspace here to demo constructing values. If you feel like it, please do open that workspace up as well. You don't have to, you can just follow what I'm doing on screen. So constructing attributes basically means manipulating values, building them together, concatenating things, whether it's a string, whether it's an arithmetic calculation, numbers, whatever. We can construct attributes around those values. How do we do that? Well, if I look under an attribute manager transformer, which is where we can create attributes, a lot of these have a drop-down arrow and gives us the 2 options there for text editor and arithmetic editor. So there are 2 editing dialogues basically to create a new attribute. Let's see what's it saying now. Yeah, so I mean, remember, it says in there, remember that sometimes you don't need to use the attribute manager to create a value. You can construct that value if you're using it somewhere else. You can construct it there directly. But if you're constructing attributes, the attribute manager transformer is the way to go. There are other transformers that will create attributes. If you look at that question on the bottom of the page, manager will, the creator will. I think the attribute copier will let you create attributes. Oh, no, I think it must be the attribute renamer. There we, no, well, I was wrong. So attribute creator, attribute manager. I think the attribute copier used to do that. Yes, it used to allow that in the past, but anyway, we don't need that. The most important transformer is the attribute manager. And so, for example, here, I can just say, let's add a new attribute. I'm going to call it my attribute. And in the dialog next to it, I could type a fixed value in, like my name or a number. Or what I can do is click on the drop down and say open a text editor, open an arithmetic editor. So I can open up a text editor and it brings up this dialog, which is our text editing dialog. And this is a place we can construct new attribute values. For example, I can, if we look in the dialog on the left, we can see all the attributes that are available. So I could say, type something in like the object ID is colon and then object ID. So I could make a sentence up like that, or I could create a new sort of object ID that's like the year number, like 2019-05 for May dash the object ID, and that might be a new ID number I'm constructing, all sorts of things like that. So I can type things in, I can put attributes in there, I can do all sorts of things. Let's see, what other menu options do we have? Parameters we'll look at later in the week. Special characters aren't really used that much. Probably the functions are the ones that you'd use the most. So we could put in a string function and say, well, if that object ID maybe had leading zeros on it or leading spaces, I could say, let's trim that string, and I can put a trim function around there. Let me see if I can increase the font size on this so you can see it a little bit better. There we go, that's better. So there we go. So I can do things like that. I can say, well, it's this bit of hard-coded text, and then it's the value of this attribute, which I'm happening to trim as well, just in case. And maybe if it was lowercase and I wanted uppercase, I could put an uppercase function around that. So we can sort of put a function inside a function and so on. If you've done any sort of basic coding or scripting languages, you'll probably sort of recognize that idea, like so. We have math functions and date functions as well. The date time functions are interesting. So for example, I could say, take the date time now and then cast it, or let's see, date time add. So let's say take the date time now and add 4 days to it, or 4 hours to it, or whatever things I'm doing, or 1 day to it. I can do a cast, I can do a difference. So I could say, well, if I've got an existing date as an attribute, let's pretend the status field was a date. What I could do is I could say date time difference between date time now comma that time comma and then minutes, for example, or days. So what that's doing is saying, well, take the value of the status field, which is the date, take today's date, find out the difference between those two dates and tell me it in days. So you can see we can do all sorts of different calculations in terms of date times and attributes and things like that. So that's the text editor. The other example we can see in here is right at the top. I've said create an attribute called full address, which is the basic street and number, the postal city, the postal province, comma, Canada. So that one's a bit of a mix again of attributes, hard-coded values like comma and space, and there's no functions in there, but again, I could use a string function and say, make it uppercase or something if it was lowercase, do a regular expression replace in there, format the string, all sorts of things there. So yeah, very powerful way to construct attribute values. Now the other dialog that was in here was the Arithmetic Editor. Actually, let's see. I think this one's a text as well. Yeah, that's the same text editor. Do we have an arithmetic editor? Yes, we do. We've got one in here. So this one is trying to calculate the taxable rate of a property. Or taxable value. So we've got a tax rate, which is a fixed attribute we created. We just said it's got a value of 1.1. And on the next one, taxable value, we do a drop down, open arithmetic editor. And here you can see we're taking the property area, multiply it by the tax rate, which was 1.1, multiply it by 0.8, and create an int. So basically round it off to an integer. So hopefully you can see that the difference between the text editor and the arithmetic editor is the text editor is handling text, the arithmetic editor is doing numeric values. So I can't go into the text editor and say, oh, calculate me 1 plus 1 in the text editor, because what it will do, it will give me a string back that says 1 plus 1, which is not what I want. If I want to add numbers like 1 plus 1, then I have to do that in the arithmetic editor instead. And there are different math functions in there that we can use in that arithmetic editor, so it's got sines, cosines, things like that. So you could do sort of trigonometry inside this if you really needed to. Ceiling, integer, they're rounding up and rounding down. Logarithms, min, max, whatever, all sorts of things. Math functions and math operators in there. So you can do all sorts of, again, fairly interesting stuff in an arithmetic editor. Let's see, FME Feature Functions. So this is one aspect I haven't covered yet. You'll notice that in the editor dialog, whether it's the text or the arithmetic editor, there's this section here called FME Feature Functions in the left-hand window. What are they? Well, they are bits of FME functionality that sort of reach down into the core of FME. Normally, when we're doing something in FME, we would use a transformer to do that. So, for example, we have the area calculator transformer here, calculating the area of each property boundary and putting it into an attribute called property area. What I could do instead, and you'll notice that property area is used in this calculation, what I could do instead is cut the area calculator transformer out and replace this with this FME feature function called area. And so basically the area function is reaching out down into the engine of FME just the same way that the area calculator transformer does, and pulls out the area of the feature and incorporates it straight into that equation that we've got there. So we've got the area of a feature, we've got the dimension of the feature, we've got the length of it, the number of coordinates in it, X and Y coordinate values as well. So again, it depends what you're going to do. It's fairly rare that I use those. In fact, a lot of these I've never used. Area and length I would use on a regular basis, I guess, inside here, because it means I can cut out a transformer. I can say, instead of the area calculator, I'm just going to put the area function into one of these arithmetic editors and just incorporate that directly in here. Some functions return numbers, some functions return strings. That's why if I open the text editor and look at the feature functions, it's a different set of functions like geometry type, attribute, coordinate system. Coordinate system returns the name of the coordinate system. You wouldn't want that in an arithmetic expression, so we don't give you access to that in the arithmetic editor, but you could use it in a text editor, so we include that. We've got the area in there. Even though area returns a number, you can incorporate it into a string like property area, area, like so. So we can do, again, we can incorporate these FME functions in both the text editor and the arithmetic editor. And like I said, that's a good way of replacing other transformers. I don't need the area calculator because I can use the area function in an expression if I want to instead. I don't need the string attribute trimmer. I don't need the string padder because I can use those, the trim functions and the pad functions inside the editor as well. The thing you got to remember though is that it makes your workspace more compact to do that. It makes it a bit more elegant, to be honest. But what it won't do, it won't make your workspace more readable. Like for example, if I look at this workspace I have on screen, I can see an area calculator. I know what that transformer does. I know it calculates the area. But if I deleted that and put the area function inside the attribute manager, how do I know it's calculating area? I don't know what it's doing just by looking at it, which is an issue because sometimes you have to give your workspace to other people. Sometimes you come back to it in 6 months' time and you look at it and you're like, what was it doing? I can't remember. So there's this trade-off. It makes your workspace smaller, a bit more elegant, but it's not so easy to read what this workspace is doing just by looking at it. If I've got one attribute manager doing all of the functionality of the workspace inside it, then how do I know what it's doing? Incidentally, that's not a performance improvement. Taking a transformer out and putting the function inside the attribute manager is not going to improve the performance in any drastic way. So just because people have asked that before. There are a couple of questions. Let's see. Can we do several calculations on multiple variables in the text editor? Yeah, I mean, you can. I'm not quite sure totally what you mean there, but if you mean, can I use multiple attributes in there? Like, can I drag multiple attributes in? Yes, you can. Like the owner name 1, owner name 2, I can sort of drag those together and do something like that. And it'll run for every different feature that you have. So every feature that comes through here gets that processing carried out on it. If you want to do it on several attributes, yes, you can do it on several different attributes in the same dialog. And one other question, can I take the days value and add it to another variable in the window? Yeah, so just for the sake of interest, say I've got an attribute, I'm just going to call it test, and it's got a number 4. Oops, where am I going? Test, it's got number 4. I could put another attribute in there and say, open up the text. I think the text editor would actually, no, I want the arithmetic editor, wouldn't I? So we could say, in FME, there's always lots of ways to do the same thing, but no, it's going to have to be a text editor because that's the one that's got the date functions in there. So we could say, because you're asking, can we add this to the difference? So I could say, yeah, find the difference between today's date, which is date time now, and the start date, which is, say, another attribute called status, and find the result in days. Oops, spelled days wrong. How do I add 4 onto that? Because this is not an arithmetic editor, this is a text editor. How do I add 4 onto that? Well, there is an FME feature function called evaluate, which will carry out a mathematical expression. So we can say evaluate And I like to make sure I've got extra braces around here, +4. So yeah, I can do something to generate a number as a string, but then I can put an evaluate function around it and add or take away things like that. Or not add 4, it could be add test, sorry, plus test, like so. So we can say find a difference in the time between now and the date that was in the status field, tell me what the difference is in days, then add 4 or add the value of this test attribute to it as well. So we can do things like that. And that incorporates strings and arithmetic editing all in one dialog. Okay, let's see. We have an exercise to be going on with. And we have been going for about 50 minutes. So maybe we'll start to, I think this is probably a good time we can just take a break, because I've been talking for a while, and you might be getting fed up of hearing my voice by now. So we'll take a 10-minute break. But during that break, if you want to make a start on this exercise, that would be really great. So I'm going to suggest you grab a coffee, check your email if you have to, whatever, but try and make a start on this exercise that we've got coming up here. And then at 10 minutes time, I'll come back and see, Ryan, exercise 1, yeah, that's the one. So yeah, so that's the link to the exercise. So have a go at that exercise, taxation report project. It's going to use attribute manager just as we were doing. It didn't occur to me to mention, and I probably should have, was how I know some of these things. Like, how do I know what the functions do? How do I know which date functions to use especially? Well, if you open up the text editor, the help option on the bottom has got some very useful things. Okay, obviously told you about the text editor help, but it also tells you about the feature functions, string functions, the math, and the date time functions. So for example, I can look up some date time functions in here, and it will tell me what all of those different functions do, like date time add. So I add a date. The really important one for that, I guess, is things like the fields that, where are we? Like day, date. If I was finding the difference between two dates, do I want it in minutes or days? Which units are supported? So I should be able to find date time difference. Huh. Tells me seconds. It doesn't tell me anything else. That's interesting. Maybe it tells me down here. Date time diff. There you go, all the arguments there, years, months, weeks, days, hours, minutes, seconds. So they're valid units. Anything else is invalid and the result's set to null. So I can find the interval anywhere from years down to seconds. I can also find the interval in ISO 8601 format, which would be like it's like 1Y, 2M, 3D, which would be like 1 year, 2 months, 3 days. So it's like a string that represents a time interval. So anyway, so you can see, wow, there's a lot of different information here. You can find if I start with a date and I compare it to a time, will that work? No, it won't. If I start with a time, compare it to another time, yeah, that's fine, and so on. If I compare a date to a date time, that'll work. That's fine as well. Obviously, there might be a bit of rounding in that case, and so on. So, yeah. So whenever you're in the editor, look under the help option, string functions, math functions, date time functions, and so on. It'll tell you everything you need to know about them in quite a lot of detail. What they do, how they work, what the equivalent transformer would be, in that case a string searcher, string case changer, and so on, string padder. So you know what transformer you could use instead if you wanted to. So yeah, the help functions on that dialog, very useful. Okay, let's get on to the exercise that we're working through. So it's got a starting workspace. I'm going to click the open button, and it is in Workspaces, Desktop Advanced, Exercise 1 Begin, Attributes Exercise 1 Begin. There we go. So this is my starting workspace. It is reading some zoning data, some building footprints. Let's see, let's scroll down a bit. So the attribute value mapper is saying, well, give me a different tax multiplier for every different zoning type, and generate an ID number for every building footprint. So I guess what we're doing here is we are trying to generate a property tax report, and we're going to use FME to carry out that processing. We've got a partial workspace that already exists. We just need to do a bit of extra work on that. So for each building footprint, we've got a spatial filter which copies over the attribute. So basically, if I run that workspace, just press F5, it'll run up to the spatial filter, and we should find that each building footprint is filtered by zone and also has a zone number applied to it. Obviously, it's going to take a minute or so. And yeah, this is probably a good time to talk about some of the things about the visual preview window, because that's new for 2019 and you might not be familiar with the visual preview window. So the visual preview window says, okay, if you click on something, you'll see it in that window at the bottom, as long as it's cached. So I could click on the attribute value mapper, click on the GeoID generator, click on the spatial filter, click on the source data, so on, and it will change. If I don't want it to change every time I click on something, there's a little button in the top left of that visual preview that says toggle automatic inspect on selection. If I turn that button off, then clicking on different things won't update that window automatically. I actually have to click on the green button to force it to do that. So don't think you're stuck with that updating every time you click on something. There's that little button there that will let you turn that functionality off. The other thing you can do as well is there's a little button on there that opens up the data inspector with that data in. So if you think you're seeing too many windows here, like I've got display control, table, and graphics, it's all shoehorned in at the bottom. If I don't want to see it all in that, I can click on the data inspector and it'll say, okay, let's show you this data in the data inspector instead, which gives you a bigger window to look at. So there's different ways of inspecting the data. Personally, at first, I really didn't like the visual preview. I thought it got in the way and it didn't do much for me. But as I've been using it and as I've been writing this training material here, it really became obvious that it's quite a useful piece of functionality. Not for a lot of things, but just if you want to just check if something's worked or not. So attribute value mapper, did that work? Did we get a tax multiplier? Yes, we did. Fine, it worked, I'm happy. So it's very good for looking at small things like that to see if something worked. It's not so good for browsing around a large data set. You see the graphics window is quite small. I could drag this visual preview window off and dock it on my other screen if I wanted to, which would make it a bit easier. But anyway, that's there's lots of different ways of handling that. But if you for me anyway, the display control is great for just looking at small things like, did it generate that GUOID? Look at that, property ID, yes it did, so I'm happy. But if I want to browse and inspect that spatial data a bit more detail, then yeah, I'd probably use the data inspector instead. Okay, so we've got that data, we've got each building, and it should have a zone name and zone category, so that's good. To carry out our tax calculations, we'll use an attribute manager transformer. So place an attribute manager and connect it to the spatial filter past output port. So attribute manager, again, attribute manager is the key transformer for handling attributes with. Connecting up to the spatial filter. Open up the dialog. The first task is to create a numeric value for the taxation rate. Create a new attribute called tax rate, set a fixed value of 0.2. So normally I would do this at the bottom because that's where the add new attribute is. It'd be nice if we had an add new attribute option at the top, but anyway, that's so I'm creating a new attribute, tax rate, and I'm hard coding that to a value of 0.2. Like I'm not doing any sort of construction there, just set it to a fixed rate. Then I create a new attribute called tax amount, and this is where we're going to start using these dialogues, the editor dialogues. So we click on there and click Open Arithmetic Editor. And here's our dialog. So now we need the expression to calculate the tax amount. The expression or the calculation is the building footprint multiplied by the tax multiplier multiplied by the tax rate gives us a tax amount. So I can put an area function in here, FME Feature Functions area. I can just type in the symbol for multiply, the asterisk. Then it's an attribute called tax multiplier. Then you multiply it again by tax rate, like so. So we've just constructed a value in the arithmetic editor, the area of the property multiplied by its tax multiplier, which is the zoning area, multiplied by the tax rate, which is what we just created manually. We want to round the results off to 2 decimal places, and we'll do that with the round function. Let's find that. That comes under the math functions, I assume. Round, so I can double click that. So this is where sometimes it becomes a little bit interesting, and like the order of the way you select things is important. So I'm going to select everything in there and press Control C to copy it. So if I just double clicked on the round function now, it would put it sort of at the front like that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to select everything, then put the round function in. Okay, the round function replaced it. Because I selected and copied it, I can just paste it back in there again. And the precision is 2, so 2. So yeah, so when you put a function in there, like with that round function, it didn't know which part of the expression I got that it was trying to round off. So I could have just typed it manually. I could have put braces around the other bit, but for me, it was easier to do that, to put the function in, copy and paste what was there, select and copy what was there already, put the round function in, paste the previous content back into the field to be rounded, and then just type in the precision like so. Okay, so that's really what we were trying to do there. So we created a new value called tax amount. Now what do we want to do? We want to create a report, and it's in HTML, and I suspect we're going to be finding that we're going to do some more text editing content in there. So connect the attribute manager to the HTML report generator. So this transformer generates a report, statistics, information, whatever in HTML about the data that's coming in. And then we've got a HTML writer to write that out as well. And this is a great tool when you're streaming data, streaming the results on FME server. So if I publish this works-based FME server and ran it, it would stream the report back to me, which would be really very useful. Anyway, so we're going to open up the HTML report generator properties. We've got a table in there already that sort of gives it a bit of a header. And let's see, create a new entry underneath there for custom HTML. So that's the bottom one on the list. And we click over here and we get the option to create that. And we click the drop down arrow, open up a text editor. Why no arithmetic editor? Well, HTML is not just a number, it's all sorts of text and tags and everything. So FME will only show you the editing dialogues that are appropriate for that particular parameter. So here we don't care about arithmetic, or at least if we do, we can bury it inside the text editor with the evaluate function. So we open up the text editor. We're using a combination of manual text entry, FME feature functions, and FME parameters. Enter the following text. So I could just enter like brackets BR like that. BR is basically a new line character, if you like, in HTML. So we're creating a footer or a header or something for this data, for this report. Property taxation report. So I'm typing manually. I put another BR break line tag in there. Generated on what date do we want? Well, we want today's date. So I could do date time now. Date time now is interesting because it would return the date in ISO format. So it would be sort of 2019-08 2019-0513:1019 and the number of seconds. So it would be a long text string. If I want to make it a bit more interesting, I could use a datetime cast function. I think it's the cast, or is it format? One of these would let me format it into a more appropriate style for a report. How do I do that? I'm not sure. But again, I could look it up in the help and say, well, what does the datetime format function expect? And again, if I scroll down to here, datetime format. So it tells me all of the different things that I could use. Format, it's even got a link to some examples, but I could say, let's see, we got the day number in here. We must have the day number. Okay, %D. So I'm going to change this to be %D dash %B, which will be the month as a word, and %uppercase Y, which I think is a 4-digit year. Again, you don't have to do this. I'm just throwing this extra bit into this exercise because it will be an interesting thing to do. BR, again, generated, oops, don't want generated, want by, and you could put your name in there. If you're running this on server, you could look under the FME parameters and you would have FME username, I suspect, FME security user. So if you were running this on FME server, it would automatically put the name of the person who's running the workspace in there if you wanted. But for us, for now, we'll just say FME lizard using, and now we are going to use one of these things. We've got FME product name, build, FME build number on FME OS. So text strings, you'll notice, are constructed, well, basically it's very often a string rather than a single value. Like this is a string rather than a single value. So that's our custom HTML. So hopefully you can see that you can, I could have done this in the attribute manager transformer, created this as an attribute and told the HTML report generator to use this attribute, but I could just do it straight in the HTML report generator instead. So that's what I've done here. And run the workspace. And let's have a look at the output. So I really like the HTML report generator. It's a fantastic transformer. Being able to create HTML reports like that, or HTML documents. I guess it doesn't really need to be a report. Okay, let's find it. Taxation report.html. HTML, yeah. Open that up. Here's my report. It's got a property ID number, the taxable amount, property value, which was already defined in the report. And right down at the bottom should be the bit that we generated. Property taxation report generated 13th of May 2019. So I've got that. I could, I guess, put the time in there as well. So go back to my HTML. Oh, excuse my phone ringing in the background. Open text editor. Let's see the help. What have we got for time? Hours. So I would probably put at percentage H colon. We got minutes, yeah, percentage M, uppercase and lowercase do matter here. And then percent P. Let's see. I guess I don't need to know if it's AM or PM, but anyway, I'm going to leave it in there. Hit the run button again. This time it's only running the report generator because the attribute manager is already cached. And I can come back to my HTML report, hit the refresh button. It should reload that. Bottom of the page. It's still loading it. There we go, at 10:24 a.m. So I added the time in there. And again, this is the exercise. You can work through the steps exactly as it says. Or if you want to go off-road a little bit and do a few different things, you can do. And you'll notice it says using FME 29.001, build number 19246 on Windows. So that's the sort of thing you might keep as metadata for a project like this. Yeah, so that's about that. And like I mentioned, the HTML report generator is fantastic on FME server because you can generate a report. I can publish this workspace to server. Somebody could run it and it would just stream the report straight back to them. They wouldn't need to know anything about FME. They just click on a button that says, hey, give me this report, and it streams the report back to them. So they don't need to open it up in Workbench and run the workspace, etc., etc. So I haven't seen any questions, so I'm guessing everything was okay with that. Again, please do fire any questions you've got. Ryan's there, waiting to answer anything you need answering. And again, please do let me know if I'm going too fast or too slow, whichever way you think. So what we're going to do now is look at conditional attribute values. Excuse me. I'm just going to grab a quick drink. Okay, so conditional attribute values, what are these? Well, these are tools that set a value, whether you set the value, whether you construct a value, whatever you do with it, but they do it on a conditional basis. So like in here, we set something in the attribute manager for all of our buildings. What happens if we said, well, actually the tax depends on what sort of roof type it is. If it's a certain roof type, you have a different taxable value. How do we say, well, it should be this tax value for a flat roof, but this one for a sloped roof? How do we do conditions like that? Well, this is what we're going to talk about now, conditional based attributes. So this is one example in the manual. If I just chat out the page we're on in the manual, just so you can follow along if you're not following what I'm doing on screen. So in fact, I can even open that up as a workspace. I must have it under the instructor use. Conditional values, here we go. So what I'm doing here is doing some mapping by postcode. So I'm saying, well, or by neighborhood really. Here's a test filter. Oh, it is by postcode. If it begins with, if the postcode for this area begins with V6B, V6C, V6Z, V7Y, then it's a downtown area. If it's those, it's a Fairview. So basically you can see in this test filter, we're reading the data, we're saying whatever the postcode is, split the data up on that basis, and then we go to the attribute manager and it says that neighborhood is downtown. So we set it from that. This neighborhood says Fairview. This neighborhood is Strathcona. So basically we're saying take the postcode, filter the data, set the value. That's conditional mapping. But it's not really a great way of doing things. We don't really want to have 6 attribute manager transformers and a test filter like that. It's harder for you to navigate, it's harder to edit, it's harder for other people to know what's going on. It's not particularly scalable either. If we think about this, if I needed to add a new postal code to test, I'd have to put an entry in the test filter, I'd need to add a new attribute manager. If I had 50 different postcodes I was testing, I'd need 50 different attribute manager transformers. It's not a very scalable solution to do things this way. So this is what we want to do, but this is not the right way to do it. This is not scalable. This is not easy to maintain. And we'll probably look later on in the week about performance and how to maintain a workspace and how to set it up so it's easily maintainable. But anyway, so how should we do this if we don't do it that way? Well, we should use something called conditional values, and we can do that directly in the attribute manager. And you can see in here, and I'll show you the completed one first. We can see that the neighborhood has any of 7 different possible values. And if I do the drop down, I don't open the editor in here, I open up conditional value. And here is where it shows me all the tests, just like the test filter did. And I say if it has those, then it gets the value downtown. If it's these postcodes, then it gets the value Fairview. And so all of that bit above with the attribute filter and the attribute managers, like 6 or 7 of them, all of them now are built into this one attribute manager transformer. We just click on the drop down, click conditional value, and there we go. It's like that. So you might say, well, can I show you how that works? Well, yeah, let me open up. In fact, I'm going to go back to that previous example we were just talking about with the attribute manager and the building and the taxes and say, well, what would happen if there was a different taxation amount for each different roof type? So what I would probably do is, having set this up, I would go into the Arithmetic Editor, I would copy that value like so, or cut it even completely out, just so I've got it in my storage, and then click drop down conditional value, and this is where I can start doing different conditions. So I can say, double click on that, it opens up a tester-like dialog, and here I can put in if roof type equals flat, then the attribute value is, and again I can open up the Arithmetic Editor, I can paste my function in there and say put a multiplier for the roof type times 1.1 for flat roofs, because if you've got a flat roof they're going to make you pay more tax or something, I don't know why. And then I can say if it's not flat, the default is drop down, open Arithmetic Editor, that multiplied by 0.9, like so, and click OK. And now it says, oh, well, the tax amount, you've now got 2 possible different values in there, depending on these conditions you set up. So click on the drop down, conditional value, we said if the roof type is flat, and again, notice how we don't need to just set a fixed value in there. We can still use the text in the arithmetic editors. It's just we use it inside this conditional thing now. So if the roof is flat, that's how your text is calculated. If your roof isn't flat, then it just goes to this else function, like so. I could also add another function in there and say, well, if roof type equals, let's see, I can't even think of different roof types now. We're with sloped. If your roof type is sloped, then you just get the standard tax rate. If it's anything else, then it's less than the tax rate. It's multiplied by 0.9. So that's how we can use conditional values in the attribute manager to save us having to have this scenario that we showed in the manual earlier, where you've got a test filter and a different attribute manager for every value. Instead, we can put them all into a single expression, like so. To save time and prevent data entry, you can copy and paste conditions between transformers of a different style. So let's see, if I go into here and my condition, I can probably copy that condition and I can put it into a tester. Just going to connect that tester up. That won't let me paste that. So anyway, I'm pretty sure I can copy from a tester into the test file there. Within here, I can go back to the conditional value and say, instead of creating a new condition from scratch, I can just say, well, let's copy and paste the sloped roof. And now we can double click that and change it. So if it was a domed roof, and we could even put the multiplier in this window here, 1.4 if it was a 1.3 if it was a domed roof. So the copy and paste functions are very useful here. Yeah, very, sorry, I was just looking at the question came in. So yeah, so copy and paste are your friends in this, and you can copy and paste conditions. I can even copy this conditional thing, the whole thing, and put it in a different attribute manager somewhere else, which could be in a completely different workspace, to be honest. So, because conditions are quite hard to set up, and having set them up, I want to be able to reuse it and copy them about if I can. So there you go. I can paste that directly into a different attribute manager. I could even paste it into a different attribute manager in a different workspace if I really wanted to. So copy and paste is really quite useful for conditional values like that. Yeah, so apart from the attribute manager, I could even do it on, let's see, can I do it on the spatial filter? No, see, when you look down on some of these settings, you'll find some of them do have the option for conditional values. That one's not a good one, obviously. Let's see, area calculator. So say we had an attribute that stored the units in there of spatial data. So my units are, in this case, meters, like so. What I could do is put an area calculator in there, and I'm hoping the multiplier, yeah, can be set to conditional value. So I want to get the area out in square meters. So I say, well, if the units equals feet, then the multiplier is 0.3048 or whatever it is to get from feet to meters. Otherwise, it's just 1. don't think that should be 0.3. It should be the other way. Anyway, you get the idea. So I can do that. This isn't in an attribute manager. This is inside the area calculator. So I can say, what's my multiplier? Depends what your units are, and so on, like so. And question now, can you scan the attributes for a list of valid values? Some transformers will do that. Mostly they don't. Mostly they don't because at this point, FME has not read any data. It doesn't know what that data is. So it could be anything coming through. And even if you tell it, oh, this is the data set I'm reading, if you run the workspace a week later, it might have different data and different values coming through. So generally, we don't let you scan a list of values from the source. Now, having said that, there is a couple of transformers that will do that. The attribute filter, for example. So if I say, well, these are all my zones, I want to filter the data by zone, I can use this import option and say, well, the data set is map info. Where are we? Data, zoning. So scan that. Show me all of the different values for zone name and import them into here. So there's all my different zone names imported, CD1, CRM, and so on. Or I could have used a different attribute to import. I could have said, actually, instead import from the, which one did I use before? I can't remember. There we go, zone category. So filter by zone category, and these are different values. So that works okay. It's just that it's not dynamic. It won't, if the source data changed and it had a new one like 3 family dwelling, it wouldn't update that automatically. It's not dynamic in that way. And the reason it's not dynamic is, well, even if you did have 3 family dwellings and it added a port in there when it ran, how would it know where to put that data and what to do with that data? So generally, we don't do that. Even if it's cached, as you can do now, we generally don't let you pick source values. Okay, so anyway, when to use conditional values. So they're great. You'd use it when it gets a bit more complicated than you can use in a single transformer, like an attribute value mapper. It's a way of making use of your space so you don't have to use multiple attribute creators or attribute managers. You're not having to use multiple transformers. And that's sort of a rule of mine. If you're using like 20 transformers that are all the same type, to me, you're probably doing something wrong because we don't like you in FME to have to do that. If you're using 20 transformers in a row that are all the same type of transformer, normally we like to try and give you an alternative that condenses that down to 1. So that's a sort of general rule of mine. And in this case, when you're filtering data and using attribute managers like that, using conditional values is probably a bit easier. The question at the bottom of the page, the output attribute value in the conditional setup can be which of these? So going back to the attribute manager, we say we've got 4 different values. They were all values that I created, constructed from a text. So I know that works. We also know that a single sort of plain value works because I did that on the area calculator, like so. No action. Yeah, we can actually do that. We can say, click on the drop-down list and say, take no action. So if the roof is flat, it gets that tax. If it's sloped, that tax. Domed, that tax. If it's some other sort of roof, then just take no action. Or maybe we would say, if it's in any other sort of roof, then stop the translation because something's gone wrong, and we can even put a message in there that says invalid roof type, translation cancelled or stopped or something. So we say, well, if it's one of these roofs, do this. If it's not one of those, stop it. So in fact, all of those options are possible. You can set your conditional values to a simple value, a constructed value. You can do no action at all, or you can give FME a command to say, cancel this translation. And the other one is null, and we'll look at nulls later. So like that. So let's check that. And yes, we're right. All of those are valid. So good. Can you set a parameter? I'm looking at a question now. Can you set a parameter from a data set to use it later? Set a parameter. Let's see. I'm not quite sure what you mean there. Set a parameter from a data set to use it later. Let's see. There are some things that information we can get from a data set. If we look in our source data feature type, we can see where it's coming from, a zones table in a map intro data set. We can see these are the attributes. We also have what we call format attributes. This might be what you're talking about here. Like I can say if the pen color, I can expose the pen color, and that will tell me what color of feature was coming through. So if I had all of my zoning was on one layer, it didn't have any attributes to tell me the name or the category, but it had a color, well then I could do something like that and say, let's see, what zone type is it? Well, that depends on conditional value. If, oops, don't need that there. If the attribute for pen color was red, then it means it's industrial. And I can sort of copy and paste that and say, well, if it was blue, it would be commercial and so on. So I'm not sure quite what you mean there, but if you mean that you want to get something from a data set like that, you can certainly do that. You have an attribute that you want to use, but you don't know which attribute it is. Yeah, I think that will come up later this week when we cover the FME parameters thing. What you're asking there is there a way for someone to select an attribute? And just to show you very, very quickly, since you've asked, in the navigator window, there's a section on user parameters. Create a parameter, and it will be of type attribute name. And you can say attribute name, select attribute, and basically if I run this, it'll say, yeah, which attribute do you want? And it depends where I'm using it. So here, for example, if it was the attribute value mapper, I could say, well, use that attribute name I just created. Run the translation. It says, okay, which attribute do you want? I could say map info pen color. It'll use that. Or I could say zone category. It'll use that. So yes, it's possible. But again, we're going to cover that later this week, so don't worry too much about it now. Okay, let's do this exercise and then we'll take another break. Flood risk project. So what we're going to do here is assess the flood risk for the city of Vancouver based on two different factors. One of the factors is the elevation of each property. So we can say, is this property from 0 to 10 meters above sea level? Is it 10 to 25 meters? Is it 25 to 60 meters above sea level? And also, how far from the shoreline is it? Is it 100 meters or less from the shoreline, 200 meters or less, 300 meters or less? And you can see, if we just chat out the link to that exercise. So you can see on that table right at the start of the exercise that we have this sort of table that combines the two. So you say, well, if my house is between 100 and 200 meters from the shoreline and it's 40 meters above sea level, then it's a category 4 risk. If it's less than 100 meters in from the shoreline, and it's lower than 10 meters in elevation, it's a category 1 risk. So 1 is obviously higher risk, 5 is obviously a lower risk. So we've got a workspace that's sort of been worked on. Exercise 2 begin. So your colleagues worked on this exercise and they've got the postal addresses being read. They're reading the coastal zones. They're finding out which zone each address falls inside, and they're finding out the elevation from a raster elevation model. So what should come out of the attribute renamer is we have each address and we know its elevation and we know which zone distance from the shoreline it falls inside. So now we just have to say, well, how do we map that information to these values? And so that's what the whole task about this is. Now, what I should do at this point is just run the workspace. Why run the workspace? Well, because I can be looking through the instructions as to what I need to do, and in the background it's all automatically running and caching everything, so it can be doing work while I'm doing my work as well. So yeah, turn on feature caching and run the workspace. I did that. Don't worry about that message unexpected input that comes up. Let's instead look at the output of the attribute renamer, query a feature, and it tells me its elevation is 14. And it's, let's see, it's got to tell me the zone 300. So it's 300 meters or more from the coast, and it's at an elevation of 14. So that means for that address, it would come as a category 4 risk. It's 14 meters above sea level, 300 meters from the sea, category 4 risk. Whereas this other one I could look at, elevation of 7, and its zone is 100. So elevation of 7 puts it in here, zone of 100 puts it in there. So it gets a value of 1 for its flood risk. So you can see now what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to take those numbers and try and map them to give us the right flood risk number for each different property in the city. Now, there's lots of ways to carry out this technique. There's filtering, there's data mapping. Conditional filtering means we could do the same as we did as that previous one that we showed that wasn't really a great example. And you can see it here. We've got an attribute filter, and then we've got attribute range mappers, 3 of those. And again, every time we're duplicating that transformer, it's not good. So if you wanted to say add 400 meters, 500 meters zones, we'd have to add an extra attribute range mapper transformer. So that's not particularly scalable. It's much better if we can do the whole thing inside a single transformer using conditional values. So that's what we're going to do here. Okay, so you've got your workspace, it's opened up, you've run it. You can look at the data, inspect different things in here if you like, find out what's going on. Why did we drop all of these points at that position? Well, I suspect it's because they were more than 300 meters from the coast. So yeah, if it didn't overlap into one of those zones, it's more than 300 meters from the coast, we're not going to worry about it. So that's what that tester does. And you can see the raster DEM just looks sort of like this. And you can click on that and see that each different cell has a different elevation value and so on. So yeah, so feel free to run that and look at the different outputs at various points. But what we're going to do is put an attribute manager transformer down to create this flood risk attribute. So I put an attribute manager transformer down, I'm connecting it up to that attribute renamer, like so. And I'm going to open it up. And I'm don't really care about any attributes that are there. I'm going to come right down to the bottom and I'm going to create a new attribute called flood risk. The more I think about it, the more I'm going to ask our developers if we can put an add new attribute field right at the top as well, because I think that will be quite useful. Anyway, so we've got flood risk is our attribute we're going to create. We are going to click on the drop-down arrow next to it, and instead of picking out one of the editors like we would have done before, we are going to go with conditional value. So I'm going to sort of go through this fairly slowly, step by step, just to make sure everyone's keeping up to me at each step. So you put the attribute manager down, you say, I want to create a new attribute called flood risk, click on the drop down, click on conditional value, like so. And this opens up at one of the dialogues to start defining the conditions and the values that apply for each different condition. So how do I start defining this? Well, in the first column where it's got if, or the first row where it says if, I'm going to double click in the first column for the test condition, and it pops this up. And if you've used the tester transformer before, you should be fairly familiar with this sort of dialogue. It's setting up a test for us. So let's set up the conditions where flood risk equals 1, which is the highest. So what conditions cause it to be a flood risk of 1? Well, if I scroll back up to the table, it's where the elevation is less than 10 and the distance to the sea is less than 100. So that's what I'm going to do, put in my test. So I'm going to do, so click the drop down, click attribute value, zone. Did that work? Did I miss? There we go. Zone equals 100. So if it's in the 100-meter zone, so we haven't got an exact distance from the sea. We've actually said it's got different zones. The 100-meter zone means it's from 0 to 100 meters away. So zone equals 100 and elevation equals or is less than or equal to 10, because the elevation could be in there. It's not in a band the same way that the zone is. So we've got those two settings. Now the one thing that we need to make sure here is that it's not whether it's in that zone or has that elevation. It has to be the zone and the elevation to be the right result. So in the logic column, we have to click on that where it says or and change it to and. This is different to how it used to be in FME 2018 and earlier. If you remember in 2018 and earlier, it used to come in the bottom, you would have like a composite test and you would type the test in there. 2019 doesn't do that. 2019 says you drop down, you click in the logic column and you pick and or whatever in there. So if the zone equals the 100-meter zone and the elevation is less than 10, then that is flood risk number 1. That's the highest flood risk that you've got. So you enter the value like so. We click OK, and we've got that set up. So now if we want to know just what the highest ones were, I could click OK to exit out of this, hit the run button and look at the data and say, well, what have we got in this table? Let's turn off the map view. We should have a zone flood risk field. Flood risk equals 1. And at some point it's going to be missing because we just didn't set it up for everything. So all I did there was just set it up for a flood risk of 1. So, and you can see if I go back into the attribute manager, there's 2 possible values. It's either 1 or it's nothing at all. But we don't want to stop at just 1. We want to put all of the values in there, all the possible flood risks. So again, click on the drop down, choose conditional value. Let's go back into here. How do we add the second one? Well, we could do it the same way. I could click in the else if place and set it up manually. Actually, yes, it says to do that. So we're not going to copy that first one. We're just going to double click in the else if field and set that up separately because the logic's a little bit more complex. Okay, so we want zone equals 200. 100 and elevation. So what I'm trying to do is find where the flood risk equals 2. If we go back up to this table I've got, this is our master table, the flood risk equals 2 in 2 different scenarios. One where you're in a medium distance from this above sea level, but close to the sea. And the other one is where you're not quite as close, but you're at a lower elevation. So those are the 2 different scenarios that you can be flood risk to. So elevation is less than or equal to 25. I think that's right. Let me just scroll back down to the instructions just to make sure I am getting this right. Zone equals 200, no. Zone equals 200, elevation is less than or equal to 10. And the other option is zone equals 100 and the elevation is less than or equal to 25. So we've got our 4 conditions in there. The 4 conditions are set up, but what we don't have yet is the logic set up. So what we want to say is if this zone and that elevation, or that zone and that elevation. So I'm going to start putting braces and brackets around things. So if that and that, now we need a close bracket, I guess. Yeah, the closed bracket's going to come on the next line, I think. So, oh, there we go, or something. That's going to be an and, like so. So what we're saying there is if zone equals 200 and the elevation is less than 10, or if zone equals 100 and the elevation is less than 25, then it's a flood risk 2. So the logic can be a little bit complicated to try and sort of figure out, but if you hover over the logic field with your mouse, it will show you what the expression you've created is, which here is brackets 1 and 2, close brackets, or open brackets 3 and 4, close brackets. It's supposed to disappear. There we go. So if you're ever stuck, do the mouse over and it will hover up with that tooltip. We are going to make some changes for 2019.1. We're going to refine this dialog a bit more just to make it a bit easier to use. And probably instead of it just being a tooltip, we'll put that expression further down in the dialog as well. But for now, just hover over that. That'll tell you your expression. And there we go. So that's flood risk equals 2. So it should look like that. So now step 4 says just set up the remaining test filter conditions. So we have zones 3, 4, and 5 to do. And you can see flood risk 3 occurs in 3 different scenarios. Flood risk 4 occurs in 2 different scenarios. Flood risk 5 is 1. So this is where I think we can start using the copy function to make things a little bit easier. So for example, I've got flood risk equals 2. If I click on that test condition and do copy, paste, I get the same thing again, but now it's easier to go into this and set it up to be flood risk 4. And I can just scroll back up to find out what the values are where it's flood risk 4. We are talking a zone of 300 with an elevation of less than 25, and the other one is a zone of 200 with an elevation less than 60, and that becomes a grade 4 risk. So the copy and paste function is really quite useful, and I can do the same thing with that first one as well, because there's only one setting in there, one test. Which of these only has one test? Well, flood value 5, so I can say copy and paste that, and this can be for flood risk 5, and here it is 300 meters, and less than 60. I just need to make sure these are in the right order, so I'm going to put that right down at the bottom, like so. So I can copy and paste a lot of things now, and the only one I really have to work out is the one in the middle, the zone 3 category risk, which again I can copy and paste from a previous one, but there's going to be a little bit more work to it this time. So for zone 3, what have we got? We have, I'm going to copy and paste the first two fields of this. So zone equals 300, elevation less than 10, 200 less than 25, 100 less than 60. Again, I can scroll up just to make sure those are the correct ones. So those are the right tests that I'm doing. Just right now, the logic isn't correct, but I can correct that fairly easily. So again, it's this and this. Where are we? Want an or with the two brackets there, or that and that, or that and that. And I think that's correct now. So if I just hover over that, 1 and 2, or 3 and 4, or 5 and 6. And the numbers, by the way, refer to the line number. So line 1 and 2, or line 3 and 4, or line 5 and 6. So hopefully that doesn't take too long. Yeah, someone said it's a bit clunky, and I agree personally. With the logic set like this, I don't think it's as easy to do as it was before. But if you're a beginner, it sort of makes more sense, I guess, to do things this way. So that's why we're revising this dialog with all the ands and the ors to make it a bit more easy to set up. So hopefully I got all those numbers right. Somebody's mentioning something was wrong. So for it to be a hazard 5, it would be, okay, so now this is why the order is important, because if I set this hazard 5 to be at the top of the list, zone equals 300 and elevation is less than 60, well, that would be all of those. They would all get upset as hazard zone 5. So that's why the order is important. I don't want that to happen until I've sorted out zones 3 and 4. So that's why the logic and the way I've got it set up says that it needs to be in this order. The test filter is like a case or a switch command if you've done any sort of scripting like so. If you've done the scripting, it's like a case command or a switch command, and that's where the order becomes important. So that's why we make sure 5, I mean, we could set it up to be more precise. So we could say zone equals 300 and elevation is less than 60 and elevation is greater than 25. We could do it like that, and then it wouldn't matter which order we did it in, because we'd be defining very specific tests for each one. But we were able to get away with having fewer tests and not have to do that by having it in the right order. So if we've got it in the right order, we don't need that second elevation test. We can say anything that's less than 60 and in zone 300, because if it was in zone 300, those lower elevations will have been dealt with already in flood risk 3 or 4. So that's how we can get away with that. Question, are we able to write the SQL for the conditional statements? No, and again, this is why I see when people say, yeah, this is clunky, and this is one of the things that I'm pushing to get changed, because yeah, it really will be easier if I could just type in a single line of something as opposed to having to do it in that builder. And yeah, that's about all I can really say. Yeah, I know it's clunky, and I'm pushing to get that changed. So yeah. But anyway, the important thing there, perhaps, well, the important thing definitely should not be the clunkiness of the test interface. It should be the ability to do sorry, my mind's it's the conditional values that's really the important thing. So by setting the conditional values in that way, we can do everything inside a single transformer rather than having to have several transformers. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, again, this is an interesting one because the order in this dialog matters as well. I was going to say, well, I don't need the elevation attribute in the output, so I could delete that. I don't want the elevation attribute in the output, so I could delete it from here. But if I delete it at the top of this dialog, then suddenly my conditional values are going funny because they rely on elevation. So again, the order is important in here. And if I put my calculation at the top of the page, the top of the list, and then delete elevation, or rather, sorry, delete like that, then there's no problem with a flood risk because I've already used elevation before I got to that line. So the order is actually important in this dialog as well. I'm going to get rid of all of these attributes. I don't really want to see any of those in the output. All I really care about is the flood risk. So I'm going to run that, and I can actually, I'm going to open it up in the data inspector, and I can click on any of these properties now, and I can see the flood risk is 3. That's got a flood risk of 3. Presumably it's close to the coast but higher elevation. If I really wanted to, I could add, I know there's some data in here that's like a coastline. If I look in the boundaries folder, land boundary, shapefile, if I add that to the background, now I can sort of get a good idea of things. So that's sort of a little bit of further from the coastline than perhaps it looked. And these are all very close to the coastline, and I suspect they're at a low elevation, so they'll have a flood risk of 1. And these are further away and higher up, so they'll have a flood risk of 4, 4, 5. There we go. That must be a little bit higher up, and so on. So yeah. So that is that exercise using conditional values. And again, it's really nice because I don't need to have multiple attribute manager transformers. I don't need to have multiple tester transformers or test filter transformers or anything like that. I can just put everything inside one attribute manager. And again, I guess it does make it a little bit harder for people to see, but I can easily put a piece of annotation there that says calculate flood risk using conditional values. And that way, anyone who comes and looks at this workspace knows what's going on inside that transformer. There we go. Let's see. Yeah, so on step 5, it says add an inspector transformer. Why does it say that? Well, because if we put an inspector transformer on, we can go into there and do a group by and say group by the flood risk, and that splits the data up for us. So I can do that, open it up in the data inspector, and now you can see we've got different layers for each different risk. So I can say this is flood risk 1, I think. Yep, that's flood risk 1. Again, I can add that background map just to give me an idea of what I'm dealing with. So those are flood risk 1. You can see they're fairly close to the coast. You can't tell the elevation from that, but I'm guessing they're low as well. These are flood risk 2, so if they're right on the coast, they're probably a bit higher up in elevation. Flood risk 3, 4, and 5. So if you're a 5, then you're the lowest flood risk in Vancouver, according to our calculations anyway. So yeah, so that's how that works, and using conditional values, conditional attribute mapping. And like it says at the bottom, there's fewer transformers. Does it make the workspace better? While it's more aesthetic, perhaps there's fewer things going on, but you really need to add annotation like this so that people coming along will know what's going on with that transformer. There's another question, a couple of questions, I think. So one of them was, what does the overlaps test in the tester mean? What that means is, so we've got the postal addresses being read here. So these are all the addresses. These are all of our different zones. So we've got our zones like that. And basically what we're saying is, let's show all of that. So those are our different zones, and we're doing a point and area overlay, and that produces an attribute called underscore overlaps, which basically tells us, does the address fall inside one of these zones? And if overlaps equals 1, then basically, yes, it falls inside one of our zones. If overlaps was 0, like here, it would basically mean that's an address which falls outside our, it's more than 300 meters from the coast because it didn't fall inside any of the zones that we have. So if we look at that, if we look at what failed in the tester, basically we should see that those are all addresses that didn't fall inside those zones, like that. Okay, so one other question, how do I see multiple layers in the inspection window? Okay, so that's a good question. So what you can do is you can select multiple objects all at once, and it will show you in there. So I can select all of those 3 zones, and I can also press the control key down and click on the tester, and that gives me those addresses as well in test and passed. So it's just a case of selecting multiple objects. And again, this little button down on the left will open that in the data inspector to give me a bit more of a view. And now I can see, oh yeah, if I turn off the test failed, okay, now I can see that the ones that passed are the ones inside the zones and everything else isn't. So yeah, so it's just a case of, to see multiple items in the preview window or the inspection window, it's just a case of selecting multiple objects on the canvas like that. Somebody was asking, can I use a web service to read my source data, like gauge values and things like that? Yeah, absolutely. You can read data from a web service. It depends what sort of web service it is. But for example, if my coastal zones data was stored on a web service like Dropbox or FME Server or Google Drive or OneDrive or whatever, I could just read the file from there directly using the reader. If it was another web service entirely, then you've got the HTTP caller transformer that I can use, that I could say, hey, fetch this data from something.com/whatever, whatever web service it is, would probably be a GET, and so on. So yeah, there's lots of different ways of reading data directly from a web service, and that is something I think we'll cover on Wednesday. So we're going to look at adjacent feature attributes, or sometimes called multiple feature attributes. What do they do? Well, basically, when you read something in FME, you read one feature at a time. So like in the last one, we read one address, all the attributes we had were attached to that address. But what happens if we said, hey, I want to get the address from the previous feature, to find out where that was, to find out maybe what location it is, how far away it is, that sort of thing. How could I do that? Well, you can do that in FME using this idea called adjacent feature attributes. And if you look in the manual, there's this sort of X and Y column of coordinates, and you say, well, okay, I know each coordinate in turn, but it's an offset from the previous one. And how do I know what the previous coordinate was? Well, we can do that with this adjacent feature functionality. So take this workspace, for example. I'm reading a list of business license records, and it's sorted in the order they were issued. So we're sorting by the date of issue. We're just doing a test in there. It doesn't really matter why. We're just checking to make sure there is a date that it was issued, and then we're making sure it's in the right format as well, and we're sorting by that data. So now we can say, well, okay, I've got all my business licenses, and I've got their records, and what I want to do is find out the time difference between two licenses being issued. How do I do that? I could say, well, I could subtract the date of the current record from the previous record, but how do I know what that is? Well, how we do that is by checking this option here. It comes under Advanced Attribute Handling, and it's normally compressed by default, so you might have to expand that. So you expand that section, you click the checkbox, and in this case we say, I just want to know the attributes of the prior feature. So what this does, it lets me have access to the attributes from the previous feature, not just the one I'm working on. So in this case, I can go to this time offset, I can open up the text editor, and I can say, find me the difference between the time this one was issued minus the time the previous one was issued, the previous license. And how do we tell it it's the previous license? Because we put a brackets -1 in there. So feature -1. So we say, if you want to find an attribute from a different feature, you just put in this feature -1 or whatever. And handily, when you look under the attributes in this dialog, it shows you feature -1 as well. So you can just say double click on that. So rather than having to type that all in, I could say it was a previous record's date of issue, double click that, and it fills it all in automatically for me. So this is a way of fetching the previous record or even the next record if I really wanted to. So I could say, as well as fetching the previous record, fetch the next record as well. And well, we could do time offset 2. So I could just copy and paste that and say time offset 2 is rather than -1, it will be +1 because it's the next record, not the previous record. So basically feature 0 is the current record I'm working on, and you don't even need to put feature 0, it's just assumed. Minus and a number tells me minus however many features, plus tells me plus how many features. So yeah, the other one will be is I could say minus and change that number to be -4, for example, but that gets highlighted in red because I don't have the fourth record exposed. I've only got the first one record. So I could say, tell me the previous 5 records and the next 5 records. And I could say if there was a tax value for each property, I could say find out the cumulative tax by going into the Arithmetic Editor and saying the tax value of minus the 5th previous record plus the tax value of the 4th previous record plus the tax value of the 3rd, etc., etc. So I could accumulate the tax values of the 10 surrounding features. And when I say surrounding and adjacent, this isn't a spatial thing. This is the order of the records being read through the workspace in FME. It's not a spatial thing, not unless the data was sorted spatially in any way. So that's what that is. The other thing to take note of is what happens if a value is missing, and you've got this option here that says substitute missing, null, and empty. So if something, if I was adding up tax values and there wasn't a value for anything, I could say use a default value of 100, or I could say don't bother, just don't substitute it, just ignore that. Or we could say find the closest available adjacent feature, so the record that's closest that does have a value, use that instead. And obviously that's quite important, because if I say fetch me the prior feature, well, the first record through doesn't have a prior feature, so I've got to make some sort of way of handling that. So probably the best way of doing this is to just showing this and demoing is to go straight into this exercise 3, precipitation calculations. Again, I'll chat that link out to that. So what do we got to do in this exercise? Well, we don't have a starting workspace, but we've got a source data set, and it's a spreadsheet of rainfall in the city of Vancouver, and it tells me the rainfall for January, February, March, blah, blah, blah. The only problem is it's a cumulative amount, and I don't want the cumulative amount. I want to find out the amount for that month. So if I want to find out how much rainfall there is in June, I would need to say take 595 minus the 541 from before. How do I do that in FME? Well, you use the previous feature attributes or adjacent feature attributes. So this is what the task is here. We want to convert these numbers from cumulative to absolute numbers for every month. So let's go back into Workbench and hit the generate option and generate as a new workspace. So again, follow through these steps as I'm doing them. The source data is Excel, and the source data set comes under data, elevation model, precipitation, and we are going to write back out to Excel, and we'll just pick an output file. We'll put it in the output folder, so FME data 2019 output training, and we'll call it monthly, if I could spell, monthly precipitation, or you can just put rain or rainfall if you prefer. So we're generating a workspace. It's reading that Excel spreadsheet. It's writing to a new Excel spreadsheet. And I'm just going to shift that up a little bit because obviously I want everything on screen. So this is what we're reading. And this is what we're writing. So what we need to do now is put an attribute manager in the middle to carry out that calculation. So I'm just going to click on that connection between the two. I'm going to type attribute manager and put one of those transformers down. And you'll notice by default the attribute manager doesn't do anything. So features and attributes are passing through it. So we don't have to, I guess I'm just saying you don't have to set everything up in the attribute manager straight away. If I ran the workspace now, it would still work. But anyway, let's open up the parameters. Okay, so the important thing is that we need the value of the previous record to subtract from the value that we currently have. So we expand this attribute value handling section of the attribute manager. We hide it by default because it's fairly rare that you use that, and we don't want you to have to see that bit of dialogue all of the time when it's not being used. So that's why that sort of section is collapsed, but it is important enough to go at the top, so that's why we do that. Okay, so we've got the advanced attribute handling. We're going to put a checkbox in the adjacent feature attributes, and we're going to say number 1 in the number of prior features. In other words, we want to find out what the values are from the prior feature, please. So what happens when there isn't a prior month? Like my first month is January, or there isn't a prior month. So what should I subtract? Well, I should probably subtract 0 from that. So if I go to substitute missing null empty by, I change that to a default value of 0. And I don't think it would work if you just said no substitution, because then it would return a null value and we would be trying to calculate a value on a null. So we're going to use 0 for that. Now we're going to calculate a new precipitation value. I'll tell you right away this is going to be wrong, but it's one of those examples where going wrong at first is a good illustration of some of the things that you might not have thought about. So we go into the precipitation field, and for the new attribute value, we click on there, we click on the drop down, and we pick Open Arithmetic Editor. So now we just need to carry out our calculation, and there's the precipitation value for this month. Hit the minus key for a minus, subtract, and subtract the precipitation from the previous month. Double click that. So in other words, this feature now has access to the previous month's records, and we can subtract one from the other. So we click OK, we accept those changes, and we run that translation. And then I look at the output, as we should do. And here is the output. So January was 168, February 105, March 282. Okay, this does not look right, because how have I got 4 times as much rainfall in July as I did in February? That doesn't make sense. Not even in Vancouver does it rain 600 millimeters or whatever in a single month. So something's not quite right. Something went wrong. Why did that happen? Well, it's because I said fetch the number from the prior feature, but by the time I'm fetching the value for, by the time I'm processing March, the value for February has already been changed. You see what I mean? So it's dynamic. It's working dynamically. It's not saying the value of the previous month as it was when we read the data. It's actually saying, tell me the value of the previous month when it passed through the attribute manager, or rather when it passed out of the attribute manager. So that's where things have gone wrong here, because by the time, by the time I got to say July, I was subtracting June, but June had already been processed, so it was using the wrong value. And June minus May, well, that was using the wrong value, so that because it had already been processed. So in other words, it's dynamic. We need to not just use the previous value, but put the new value into a copy of the attribute. As it says in the manual, the previous record's processing skews the calculation of the next one. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we are going to go into the writer schema for the output, look at the user attributes, and it says actually in the manual to change precipitation to monthly, but I'm going to keep both of them just because I think we can do that. I don't see why it would be bad to do that. So I'm going to keep both of them in there, just so we've got the cumulative and the individual like that. So I'm going to rename that attribute, or rather add a new attribute called monthly precipitation. I'm going to go back to the attribute manager. I'm going to come into where the precipitation is, and I'm going to change the output to be do nothing. Why am I doing that? Well, because so far I've set that up to do something, and if I don't reset it, that it's going to go bad. So I'm going to change that line to do nothing. So in other words, don't do anything to precipitation. So don't overwrite that value each time. But now I'm going to create monthly precipitation. Oops. And that is where we open the arithmetic editor. And now we say calculate monthly precipitation as being precipitation minus the previous month's value, which won't have been overwritten now because we're overwriting to a new attribute. Hopefully that makes sense. And again, you'll see it when you try it. Click OK, OK again, run that translation, and now now you can see that the output. Okay, I know what I did wrong there. It's because I ran the Excel workspace, ran the workspace twice, and I didn't look at step 7, did I? Which says check for the writer parameter, overwrite existing file, and set it to yes. I suspect the other thing I could do is go into here, and under drop truncate, I could say truncate the existing spreadsheet instead of dropping the whole file. I might get a bit better performance with that. But anyway, this is what the output looks like. So 168 millimeters in January. Cumulative in February is 273, but it only was 105 in February. And this looks better now because we can see July was the driest, August pretty dry as well. And then it builds back up again to the winter. So now we've got the cumulative precipitation and the monthly precipitation, like so. Okay, there was a question, how would I expose the last 10 minutes of records if a record was date time stamped? It depends. I mean, so what we're looking at here, I don't know if this relates to what we're looking at here, but what we're looking at here is how do I access the previous record within the attribute manager? And I'm not sure if you want to access the previous record, just have those last 10 minutes of records exposed. What you could do is, actually it probably would do that. So what I would do if I got a bunch of dates, like if I had some data in date order and I just wanted the last 10 minutes, I would sort the data by that date. Let's just pretend that's a date. And I think what I would do is I would also make sure that it's in a numeric ISO format of date. So I put date formatter, date time converter, convert it to the FME output format, which is the same as the ISO format, which basically you can sort. At least I think the FME. Oops, no, sorry. Okay, yes, you want the FME output format because it's a numeric one that you can sort because it's year, month, day. So basically you basically convert the date to that structure, sort the data in, let's see, would it be descending or ascending? You'd want the last records to come first. Then, let's see, that would be interesting because you want to you probably put an attribute manager down like we just did, say, tell me what the value of the previous record is, and also create this as being the value of the previous record. So you would make a note of the previous, you would make a note of basically the first time that something went through, and then you would subtract the actual date from that every time it went through. So you're creating two attributes because you want one of them finds the difference between the date and the start time and the current time, and the other one is a record that you're keeping of the start time, and you can just sort of pass that through. So I think you would need to do it like that, because if you want the last 10 minutes, well, you don't know what the last time was, so you'd have to find out what the last time was that something happened. So you would sort the data in reverse order, pick out the first record, find out what it was, and then you could pass that information on record by record and so on. So I think that's the way I do it. A good place to ask that question would be on our knowledge base, I think, because folk there would have an idea and they would a bit more time to do it than I have to talk about it. Knowledge.safe.com. And there's a ask a question in the forum thing. So I would ask that question there if you need someone to do it, and someone there will be bound to help. And I tune in there quite often as well, so I might be able to come up with something a little bit later outside of the training. But that's roughly the way I do that. Okay, last thing today to look at is null values. Null attributes are very important in FME. Not every format supports null values, but every format that does support it often does it in a different way. And we had our developers look at this, and you can have an attribute that's empty, you can have an attribute that's missing, you can have an attribute that's value as 0, you can have an attribute that actually says null, and do that. So there are lots of different ways of representing nothing in an attribute value, and FME tries to handle those. The three main methods, though, are null, empty, and missing. So consider your house. Suppose you go into the kitchen. You've just built a new house. You go into the kitchen. There's no place to put a sink in there. There's no plumbing for the sink. There's no kitchen sink at all. There's nothing related to the sink in the kitchen. That sink is missing. If there was a place for the sink and the plumbing for the sink, but the sink wasn't there, then it would be null, because you've set aside space to put the sink in the kitchen, but you haven't added it yet. So that will be equivalent to null. If there was a sink, but there was no water in it, then that will count as empty. So those are that's sort of an analogy for the three different main states that we look for in an FME attribute. If an attribute is not there at all and it was never on the schema, then it's missing. If an attribute is there, but it has no value at all, then it's empty. If the attribute is specifically tagged as being null, basically it exists, but the null is a placeholder for a later value. So that's a null. And there's this very amusing, if you Google null toilet roll, that gives you very interesting, I should not have used this as a shortcut, but if you Google null toilet roll, it comes up with these 0 versus null idea. So 0 means there's a toilet roll there that was just empty. Null means there was no roll at all, although there's a holder. And so that's sort of the difference between empty and null and missing. If there was no toilet roll holder at all, it was missing, then that would be missing in FME. So we have null, we have missing, we have empty, and those are the three main states that we have in FME. And we show those information when you log a feature. We show it in the data inspector as well. Let me open up a data set. If I find the parks data, see, I noticed some parks data. I can drag and drop that into the visual preview, by the way. I noticed some parks data that doesn't have a name, a park name. There we go, it's missing. So why is it missing? Well, that feature doesn't have it on the schema at all. It just doesn't exist on that feature at all. If it existed but it didn't have a value, that would be empty. If it existed and there was like a placeholder null value in there, then that will be obviously null. So in that case, those are all missing values. It doesn't even exist on that record. So yeah, you can find in the log window, in the data inspector, in the preview window, you can find all of those. Now, that's a good question here. How do we know something is missing? Well, the better way to look at it is the other way around. How do we know that it should exist? If I add the parks data to my workspace here, data parks. So what attributes have we got on here? This is our source schema. Our source schema has got all of these attributes. So how do we know park name is missing? Well, because park name existed on there. So we know it should exist because it was part of the schema, but that attribute is just missing from that feature. And using the previous analogy, why do we know the kitchen sink is missing? Well, because it was in the blueprints, and come on, let's face it, a kitchen should have a sink in it. Whereas if there was no sink in the bedroom, well, okay, that's not missing because who puts a sink in the bedroom? Not usually anyway. So that wouldn't be surprising, that wouldn't be missing, whereas it would in the kitchen. So it's sort of about expectation as well. If we expect something to be there and it's not, then it's missing. And in this case, we know it's in the reader schema, but it's got no attribute on it, so it's missing. So we can see those values in the data inspector, in the visual preview, in the log window. How do we manage those values? How do we handle those values? Well, we can do them with a tester transformer, for example. So I can put a tester transformer into my workspace, open it up and say, tell me where the park name, and we have these operators in here. Tell me where it's null, test if it is null, test if it's empty, test if it's missing, or tell me if it's got a value at all. So if I say test for an empty string, all the features are okay or a fail, because I guess I said if it's an empty string then it passes. I guess I could change the logic to be not. Tell me why it's not an empty string. Well, all of them pass. All of them are not empty strings. That park doesn't have a name, but it's missing, not empty. So it's an important difference there. If I say, tell me when it's missing, now we should see there's a different split. 15 have a missing name. So missing, empty is treated completely different. But we can find them using this transformer. And the opposite of that is, does it have a value? In other words, tell me if this attribute not null, not an empty string, and not missing. So that's what I'm looking for there. Let me get rid of the not. So does this attribute have a value? And it should again come up with a 65-15 split. So we know there's 15 features that have got somehow don't have a value for park name. So that's what we can do in there. We can recognize the value with a tester. We can set a value, well, in a couple of ways. One of the ways is the attribute manager. So we could say, I'll set the month to a value of null. So I can specifically say, set this value to be null in the output. And I could do that conditionally. I could say, if some sort of test, then set the output value to be null. So we can do that conditionally as well. It's either going to keep its value or it's going to be null. So we can do things like that. The other transformer that we have is a null value mapper. I think it's null value mapper. No. Null attribute mapper, that's what it is. So we can actually do something to this data. We can say, well, don't just test for that, but actually do something with it. So in other words, let's look for the park name. And we can set a test up that says if the attribute value is null or empty or missing. So in this case, I'm going to say if it's missing, if park name is missing, map it to null, because I might want to change it to null if I'm writing to a database. Like if I was reading empty values from a CSV file, writing it to a database, I might want to map empty to null because null makes more sense in a database. Or in this case, I might say, let's map it to a completely new value called no park name. So this is how we can map from missing to empty, empty to missing, empty to null, null to empty, any of those into a fixed value like no park name, and so on. So the null attribute mapper is a way to test for null values and set them to something different. So I could say check for empty, check for missing, and set it to null. Check for null, set it to empty. I could say if the attribute value is ZZZZ, then map it to null. Maybe ZZZZ is what the person who created this data thought would be a good placeholder for no value, but me, I know null is better. So map ZZZZ to null, please, because I know that's what it should be. Another example of that would be -9999. If you notice in the preview window here, ref park ID -9999. Why is that? Well, because in map info that counts as a null value. So I'm going to say actually map that from -999 to an actual null value, please. So we can test for values, we can change them, we can write null values. If I write to a data set that supports nulls and I've got nulls, then it will write it out. If the format doesn't support null, then it will write it to the closest representation. So if I've got a number that had an attribute that had a null value and I wrote it out to map info doesn't have the concept of nulls, but it does have the idea of this -9999. So FME would automatically convert that. In other words, whatever your data is, if it's null, missing, or empty, FME will map it to whatever's appropriate for the output format that you're writing to. And join, if you look at joining, the feature joiner and the feature merger transformer, you should find, like the feature joiner, you should find that there are always settings to say, what should I do if there's a null? Do I want to ignore nulls or somewhere in here? Huh, that's interesting. I thought there was an option there. This certainly is in the things like the matcher transformer. The matcher transformer says, well, do you want to attribute comparisons? Do you want to differentiate between null and missing? So if I'm trying to join or match two data sets and one of them's empty and the other one's null, should that count as a match or not? So that's what we do there. Okay, so and I think I showed you how to set null values and do that in bulk as well with the null attribute mapper. So we've pretty much covered that. So we are pretty much done for the day. All we've got, and it is 11:59, so we've got 1 minute for me to just close up for the day. What I'll say is that, just a quick review, we covered attribute handling today. So the 4 things we looked at were constructing attributes, either within a transformer, the attribute manager, and so on. We noticed that constructing it using transformers is more self-documenting, but if you put everything inside an attribute manager, it can reduce clutter a bit. We looked at conditional values, constructing an attribute according to a number of test conditions. We looked at multiple feature attributes, that was the precipitation thing, looking at previous or next records. And we looked at null attributes as well very quickly. So you should be fairly familiar now. Those are all advanced topics, by the way. Those are things we wouldn't necessarily cover in the basic training, but we cover them in the advanced training. And you might use them a little less often, but you will use most of that functionality at some point. Even if you don't know it yet, if you've got an idea in your head for something you want to do, quite often you'll be like, oh, I know, I can do that with the adjacent attribute values. So now you're aware of those at least, and you'll know when those fit into your project. So if So given that the time is done for the day, I'm just going to do one quick poll to let me know what you thought about the speed of today. Did we go too fast, too slow? How was it for you? Do let us know what you think about that. Again, that's something we can try and adjust in future training. So I'm just going to leave that open for a couple of seconds. While we're doing that, I mentioned we've got one final exercise to do, and I'll run through that exercise right now. So if you want to stay for an extra 10 minutes just to run through that exercise, we can do that now. If you don't, then that's fine as well. We can say you're done for the day and you can leave. Tomorrow we are covering, what are we doing tomorrow? I believe it is design, workspace design. Yeah, advanced workspace design. We're doing that tomorrow. I think Ryan might be your trainer tomorrow. So Ryan, we'll see you tomorrow. I'll be back on Thursday. So I will see you at that point. Yes, Ryan's a trainer tomorrow. So I'll be back on Wednesday and Friday, I think, this week. I don't know if I'm the instructor every day, but I'll be there. Okay, so if you're done for the day, thank you and goodbye, and we'll see you tomorrow. If you want to stay for this final exercise about nulls and handling nulls, then let's give that a quick run through. And it should only take, well, 5 to 10 minutes, I would think, at most. So what we're doing here is we've got a colleague who has a workspace. So let's open up that workspace. And it's called Exercise 4 Begin. So Desktop Advanced Attributes Exercise 4 Begin. This is what we've got. We've got a user who wants to write out a list of parks to a geodatabase data set. And it's important that the parks are in an alphabetical order according to their name. It's important that if a park doesn't have a name, it's written as null and that they appear last in the data set. So how are we going to do that? So, well, we've got a sorter, and you can see if we run this workspace, we're sorting the data by park name. But when we look in the output, let me inspect the output here. If we look at the output, all the parks with null come first in the list. So it's null, 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 then the A's, B's, C's, D's, E's, etc. So they're all nulls come first, which is not good. We want them to come last. The other thing is the ref park ID is not null. It says -9999, and we don't want that. We want that to be null. So we have to sort some of these out. So let's add a null attribute mapper prior to the sorter transformer. So null attribute mapper transformer prior to the sorter. So what we're going to do basically is to give these missing values, these null park names, a value ZZZ or ZZZ, so that we're forcing it to the bottom of the list when we sort it. So that's really all we're going to do in this example. So we open up the null attribute value, null attribute mapper. We click the selected attributes. We click the park name, and we say if the attribute is null, then change it or map it to the new value ZZZ, like so. So we just say selected attributes, pick the park name. If this attribute is, it says null there, but I think it should be missing. But I'm going to hedge my bets and say pick all three of them because it doesn't matter really which I pick. It says missing in the manual, so that's okay. It's probably because missing got mapped to null when we wrote to geodatabase. That's why it looked like it was null. But if I pick all three of them, then I'm bound to be covered. So if I run this translation now and inspect the output, now we should find that the data is not at the top. We start out with A, B, C, D, E. It's fantastic. It's not at the top. It's at the bottom, but it's all Z, 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 Z. We don't want that. We want it to be an actual null value. So how are we going to handle that? Or we're just going to set it back again. We're going to map it back. So we put another attribute mapper after the sorter. So null attribute mapper. And we go open that up and we say, again, we're looking for the park name. And this time we're not mapping it from null to a different value. We're mapping it from the different value to null. So I can even uncheck that from there. All we're doing is saying if the attribute value is ZZZ, map it to null. Technically, like it says in the manual, we could just turn them back into missing instead of null. And when we write them out to geodatabase, the geodatabase writer will say, missing doesn't exist in geodatabase, but null exists, so we'll use that instead. But assuming we didn't know that, null is a safer option for us there, and it's bound to give us what we want. So again, run that. So basically we're mapping, sorting, and mapping back again. And it's very simple and straightforward to do. So there we go. We've got Alexandra Park, Almond Park, Candy Livingston, blah, 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 B, C, D, E, F, G, da, 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 da. Then when we get to the end, instead of having Z, 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 we've got null, which is fine. So that's exactly what we wanted. The one thing we don't have is the ref park ID field. A lot of those values are -9999. Okay, so what do we need to fix to do that? Do we need to put more transformers down? Or can we use the existing transformers? And what we're going to try and do is use the existing transformers to do that. And all we're going to do here is go into the first null attribute mapper and say, well, if it's null, empty, missing, or it's -9999, then map it to Z. And we actually we need to pick ref park ID as well. So we say, well, in these two fields, if it's null, empty, missing, or it's -9999, then set it to this new value of ZZZ. And then we need to go back to that second null attribute mapper. And all we do there is say, it's already set up ZZZ to go back to null. So we just have to make sure it also works on that ref park ID attribute. So in other words, we've managed to do that mapping in the same transformer. That's what I'm saying before about if you put down a new null attribute mapper, like there to handle the park ID, and then another one there to map it back again, then you could say, well, actually you're duplicating that, and duplicating a transformer again and again is probably not the best way of doing things. And that certainly is the case here. So yeah, and if we look at the output now, we should find that we've got data sorted in alphabetical order, and if ref park ID doesn't have a value, then it's null and not missing. No, not -9999. There we go. I've got no idea what ref park ID means, to be honest, but it was in the data set we downloaded, so there we go. If you have time, you could filter out the park names and ref park IDs that are null and write them to a separate table. We could do that fairly easily. We just put a tester down and say, if the park name has a value and ref park ID has a value, it will be an and, not an or. So if they both have a value, you can write the data out. If they don't have a value, like these 26 features here, just write them to somewhere else, log them, inspect them, or something like that. So yeah. So that's about handling nulls. And again, This is advanced stuff. You might not always need to use this, but chances are, I'd say 95% that at some point in using FME, you'll need to know about any of the things that we covered today, whether it's null or the adjacent features or constructing things or the conditional values. All of those 4 things, I'm 95% sure you'll have to use one of them at least when you're using FME sometime in the future.